My name is Jessica Kellogg.
When I started this program last March, I was a first-year teacher. I remember getting dressed up for my first parent-teacher conference and standing outside the door. I was so excited to meet the parents of my students and get to share some good conversation about our classroom. By the end of the night, only 2 parents out of my 130 students had even come to conferences. I was so discouraged. As the year went on, I noticed that this was a reoccurring trend in every school event we had. It seemed as though the parents didn't care or just didn't know what was going on with their students at school. The problem became very clear to me. We needed more parental involvement in the classroom. I started my CBR project with a literature review. Utilizing the ADDIE model that I had learned in my Education, Design, and Evaluation course, it was very important to analyze the information and research that was already out there before I designed and developed a challenge that I would then implement with my students. I focused on 3 main points in my literature review: barriers to parental involvement, advantages to parental involvement, and tips for success. A common trend that was found in all of my research to barriers of parental involvement was a disconnect between the schools and the parents. Researchers found that parents were more likely to be involved at home. Part of this was because the children asked for help. Parents did not feel wanted or needed at the children's schools, and because they were not physically at the school, it was thought that there was no parental involvement at all. I found this was true with a lot of my students. I teach in a Title I district where a lot of my students don't come from families that have a lot of wealth or luxury, such as paying a babysitter to watch their other kids, then getting into a car and driving to an after-school event, which they might be then asked to pay or donate to some sort of cause. I had to change my way of thinking when I considered the socioeconomic barriers that existed where I taught. Maybe I was underestimating how many parents were really being involved behind closed doors. The advantages that have been documented are numerous, but here are just a few. Researchers found that students that had parents being involved had higher self-esteem and did better in school. And lastly, I looked at some tips or possible solutions. One in particular was a home note program that was utilized between parents and teachers of a school. The parents enjoyed the home note program, according to the researchers, and then more became involved after the start of the program. Epstein, another researcher, found that it's very important for schools to get parents involved, and by keeping them in the loop, it helps with the constant communication and success of the child. With these great tips in mind, I set the challenge to my students to increase parental involvement. I began with these essential questions. What type of setting or activities would be conducive to more parental involvement? Do students want and feel comfortable with their parents being involved? And could parent involvement improve school morale and students' achievement? Since I had never done anything like this at all ever before, I started Phase 1 small with a single class of 20 students. The class started by taking a pre-survey that I created using Google Docs, a tool that I learned in great detail in my Education, Design, and Evaluation course. This sparked a lot of class discussion regarding the questions that were asked, and students had the opportunity to share about how their parents were involved. The next day, students broke into groups and brainstormed ideas of how they would get their parents involved. One by one, the students went to the board and jotted down ideas that they had for getting their parents more involved. We went through each idea, allowing the students a chance to discuss the pros and cons of each proposal. As a class, the students voted and decided that they wanted to have a monthly newsletter that was emailed to their parents. I struggled with letting go of directing the students, but they really did an amazing job of getting themselves organized. The students started volunteering what topics they wanted to include in the newsletter. As a class, they created a mind map. Then they utilized Google Docs to collaborate during our lab time. I also utilized Schoology to offer a place for the students to communicate and submit excerpts so that I could format it for the final email. Some things in the newsletter included the web address to their textbook, our class website, Carnegie Learning Online, the chapters we were going to be covering that month, important test and quiz dates, homework tips, and contact information. Phase 1 was very impressive and the parents loved the emails. Of my students, 17 out of 20, or 85%, said that originally the biggest barrier to parent involvement was the times that the school offered events. After the Post survey, 19 out of 20, or 95%, stated that the email communication was the best way to communicate and keep their parents involved. We are currently still keeping these email newsletters going. After Phase 1, I was feeling a little bit brave. I analyzed the feedback from my Phase 1 students and decided to reword the surveys to make it clear that I was more understanding of any barriers that were preventing their parents from coming to school events. I also wanted this phase to be a little bit more interesting, so I added a game-like competition into the mix, which we learned about in our game strategies and motivation class. My Phase 2 included 2 advanced geometry classes. We started with the new and improved pre-survey, and I found that the data was very similar in both groups of students. When the students were asked if their parents would most likely come to an after-school event, 27 out of 40, or 68%, replied no. When asked why, a lot of them replied with multiple barriers or reasons as to why their parents were restricted in coming to events after school, such as open house or conferences. Of my students, 34 out of 40, or 85%, stated that their parents were most likely to get information about the school through email or some sort of web page. In other words, technology was the best way to reach these parents that are always on the go. My Phase 2 students struggled with any ideas because they wanted to do something huge. The next day in class, each student anonymously wrote an idea down on a piece of paper and passed it forward. I then let the students get into groups of 3 or 4, and I handed them random suggestions that were collected. Within the groups, the students debated and discussed what would be the best way to get their parents involved. The final suggestions that they wanted were returned to me, and each group got to share one idea that they liked best. Between both classes, I put the top choices on a ballot and had the students vote the next day. In both classes, the video choice won by a landslide. The students wanted to create a video or virtual open house experience that could be posted on YouTube. The next matter of business was to figure out what was to go on the videos. The students all threw out ideas while I recorded them on the smartboard. Their homework assignment that night was to decide if they wanted to be in the video and which part they wanted to do if they were speaking. The 2 nominated class leaders started setting up groups for students to filter themselves into. Some of the groups included scriptwriters, music pickers, speakers, and directors. These groups were each in charge of a separate part. They were allowed 1 day in class to come up with a game plan, order, and script. After a day of preparation and a night of practice, we recorded the videos. One student was in charge of videotaping and I stood behind to encourage and help lead if anyone got stuck on video. Once the tape was done, the editor stayed after school with me for 2 days and decided what to keep and what order to put everything in. Since most of my students were unaware of iMovie and GarageBand, I really got to impart some knowledge that I had gained in my emergent technologies and music theory courses. The parents loved it so much that we uploaded a couple more videos that we've created as a class. They love seeing what we're doing in class. Since both classes were creating videos, the competitiveness added to the excitement of the process, and both classes brought their A game to the finished product. The best part was that the students thought of an idea that I had not even conceived, and they were totally different than my first phase. I got to see sides of my students that I never would have seen if we had only stuck to geometry every day. I also got to hear from some parents that I've never ever communicated with up until this point. Here's some feedback that I received from parents that were watching the videos. The results were fantastic in both phases, and I'm already thinking about the next step. This project really opened me up to the ideas and the voices of my students. Neither of the ideas that my students came up with were even on my radar when I presented this challenge. I was ready for another after-school social event. I'm going to take their inspiration and introduce the Perfect Phase 3 that I created in my learning management course in Schoology as a way to allow parents full online access and participation in our class at all times. The process has been invaluable, and I'm currently using the knowledge and experiences that I have now to teach a course at my high school to other interested teachers. I hope to be doing more CBR projects next year. Thanks for the great experiences, Full Sail.